Okay, remember, April 28th, 2025, that huge power outage, across Spain, Portugal, parts of southern France. For a lot of people, it felt like, well, more than just some technical glitch, didn't it? Like something else was going on. All right, let's really unpack this. We've got access to some pretty unique source material here. These are transcripts from an investigative session that went really deep into what actually happened that day, looking beyond just the physical stuff, into the energetic and even the metaphysical side of things. So our mission in this deep dive, we want to pull out the most important nuggets from these frankly fascinating perceptions, try to understand the potential hidden causes the source material points to, and, figure out what it all might mean for us right now.
And what's really fascinating right from the get-go in this source material is how the event was first perceived. Not just, oh, the power's out, but almost instantly, like an energy suction. The source actually described it as a kind of hole that just opened up.
A hole? Wow. What kind of hole? What did the source suggest that was like?
Well, the perception in the source linked it to problems with energetic antenna and frequency shocks. There's this perceived intention, see, to deviate a flow of energy. But something variant happened, something went wrong. And even now, the source suggests there's still this subtle fissure, like a lingering leak from that whole attempt, still draining energy, though maybe on a much smaller scale now. It was even perceived as connected to the energetic plexus, almost like the stomach area, of beings.
Okay, so the source material paints this picture of maybe a natural energy flow, like an energetic circulatory system. The source used terms like antenna and servers or boxes, creating active, even radioactive energy. Something about a toroidal system.
Yes, exactly. And the plan, as it was perceived, was to change this flow, almost like diverting major train lines, that kind of analogy. But the sources, they indicate a shock happened before the energy even got to where they wanted to divert it. And this shock, they suggest, that's exactly where that fissure, that leak, started.
Okay, and the goal? Why try this diversion in the first place, according to the source?
It was perceived as an attempt to, well, amplify this energy and then channel it simultaneously into two different lines at a time. One of these lines, specifically, was meant to be hidden, not perceptible at all. The key thing, in the source's view, was that the diversion itself, it was supposed to be totally undetectable.
Right, okay, and here's where it gets really interesting. You said something went wrong. So what happened instead, based on these sources?
The source material describes a collapse, a total collapse of the plan. The intended diversion was seen, it wasn't hidden, the natural energy flow got hit hard. And instead of cleanly splitting the energy like they wanted, it just sort of leaked chaotically through that fissure. So the intended outcome, feeding two hidden timelines properly, it just didn't happen.
So if the energy leaked out, where did the source perceive it actually went?
Well, the perception was that a big chunk of it went somewhere. Dark. An obscure place was the term used, described as irradiating it with this kind of undeveloped energy. The source even used the phrase photons without development. Really strange. And the other two lines, the ones that were supposed to get this amplified lumina, creative energy, they didn't get what was planned either. The whole system just kind of break down.
Now, the source material, you said, looked at both physical causes and, let's call them deeper, metaphysical causes. Let's start with the physical side. What explanation did the source bring up there?
Yeah, the perceived physical cause was pretty striking. They used the term socabón, which means like an undermining or sinkhole, an attempt perceived below the Iberian Peninsula. The source described this intention to create like a conical extraction point, basically trying to pull that whole geographical area into another timeline.
Wow.
But the source is really clear here. They saw this specific physical attempt as having failed. It was perceived as using some kind of radar or vortex point technology for this extraction attempt.
Okay, failed. And what about the esoteric, the metaphysical causes? What forces did the source see at play behind all this?
This is where it points to some major conflict. A dispute, the source called it, between various energetic congregations, different races, different leaders. They were perceived as basically fighting hard over territory.
Fighting over territory. Here on Earth.
Yes, exactly. And the source perceived this intention to cause, well, catastrophic effects to the planet itself, actually restructuring continents, reassigning geographical areas.
Why? I mean, what was the perceived end goal there, according to the source?
The perception was about isolating certain territories. Places like the Iberian Peninsula were mentioned specifically, essentially trapping them in a different timeline. This involved trying to create these huge disruptive gaps in, historical records, geopolitical structures, economic systems. The source does say this bigger project is still latent, maybe still active in their view.
but they also indicate it's just not working.
So what's stopping it then? What did the source perceive is interrupting the processes?
The source points directly to non-co-creation, specifically by beings who are incarnated here. In other words, it's people not feeding these processes with fear. And crucially, the source highlighted this deep resistance of the inner essence within beings, stating it just doesn't allow the kind of connection, they use the term 1000%, that these big plans would need to actually work.
The source even mentioned the whole end of times idea, that narrative. How did the source interpret that in light of these events?
It's seen, really, in the source material as a manipulation tactic.
Yeah.
Historically maybe attempted through things like devastating wars or plagues, and now perceived as being pushed more through mind alteration, trying to make people passive like zombies or just unfocused. But the source perceives this entire narrative, this end of times thing, as a kind of big theater. And crucially, a theater that isn't really functioning as intended anymore. That resistance of the essence, they suggest, means this outcome just isn't being co-created on a mass scale.
Okay, the source material also brought up intraterrestrial beings. What role did the sources perceive them playing in all this?
They're perceived as being maybe subtler beings, connected to our timeline, yes, and also described as seeking some kind of balance within all these dynamics.
Right, and you mentioned something really interesting earlier about energetic communication failing. The source used that analogy of an interphone, like an intercom getting stuck.
Yes, this is really key, according to the source. That attempt to divert the energy flow, it was perceived as having broken down existing control barriers. The source suggests that when the physical, the electronic interface, went down in that region, an energetic or esoteric interface was just automatically activated instead.
So it wasn't just that things shut off, something else actually switched on. That's the perception.
Exactly. That's what the source perceived. That information from what they called intrastellar and intraterrestrial levels suddenly became perceivable, instantly for some. It was described like, the external system failed and boom, something innate within beings just took over. The source used this analogy like taking a sudden cold water dip and all your internal sensors just fire up.
That really suggests, based on this source, that maybe our own human abilities are far less dependent on external tech than we usually think.
The source material strongly supports that idea. It perceived that beings became really aware, profoundly aware of their own autonomy, much less reliant on some external controlling system. It was described almost like a great mind, but a mind characterized by chaos and interference being effectively turned off for many people during that time.
And this impact, okay, the physical blackout was focused geographically, but the source perceived this as having a global energetic reach.
Yes, the source definitely perceived a global impact, even though the jamming, the physical effects, were localized in those specific sectors. The source even noted that personal experiences, maybe like your own during the blackout, that feeling you described of deep relaxation, like a reset, your system finding balance, that seemed to align perfectly with this perceived activation of innate energy and self-regulation. The process was described by the source almost like your brain was decodifying past timelines, using that energy shift to realign things internally. Very interesting connection.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Did the source material suggest that, governments, the authorities knew about this beforehand?
On this, the source was very clear, yes.
Yeah.
They were perceived as being aware and even involved, specifically the military. Perceived as being ready, standing by, to intervene during the mass chaos and violence that the orchestrators apparently expected to happen.
But that chaos, it didn't really materialize on the scale they intended, did it?
No, not according to the source. They perceived that even these figures, government, military, they experience a different click, was the phrase used. It was almost like they temporarily forgot their instructions, as if some kind of hypnosis or programming was just momentarily lifted.
So who did the source perceive was really behind this whole attempt?
A small elite group was perceived as orchestrating it, and other rulers, globally, the source suggested, were reportedly just waiting for this chain reaction of chaos that would basically allow them to loot assets, physical assets, monetary, even art was specifically mentioned.
Looting on a global scale. That was the plan.
That was the perceived intention described in the source, yes. But the source stated very clearly that chain reaction broke. It didn't reach or didn't significantly impact many countries. They listed regions like the Middle East, Asia, Russia, Switzerland, the UK, parts of Africa, large parts of South and North America, especially the US. The food chain, as the source graphically called it, this anticipated cascade of chaos and looting it, was broken.
And what about that energetic looting the source mentioned? Stealing primary energetic resource, like plasma or blood energy. What was that about?
Yes, that was perceived as the perhaps deeper goal according to the source. Extracting energy directly from human beings by generating mass fear, anguish, panic. But this attempt, too, failed in the source's perception. That energy was somehow cut or maybe transformed during the event. This is where the source saw these major cracks appearing in their larger plans.
How did the collective consciousness react to all of this, according to the source's perception?
Well, the source perceives certain symbols, like the United Nations, as being sort of extinguished in the collective psyche, and the European Union perceived as constricted, seen as being internally in dispute. There's this perceived growing understanding of the collapse, the degradation of the old structures. And this, according to the source, is driving an increasing imperative towards individual autonomy among people.
So the perception is people are starting to see through the old control mechanisms.
The source perceived a growing awareness, yes, that these macabre minds and elites will keep trying to make humans feel powerless. But the collective is starting to create a different environment where maybe if traditional money systems fail, there's this felt instinct for equitable, balanced support, something the source saw reflected even in how communities respond to local disasters. The source suggests this whole event gave the elites a pretty significant input, a realization perhaps that they don't have the kind of control they thought they did.
That connection to geopolitics, and specifically institutions like the VTK, the Vatican, it came up again later in the source material, didn't it?
It did, yes. The source linked these blackouts to attempts by certain structures, mentioning the VTK specifically, attempts to instill fear, push people towards needing some kind of external savior figure or system. But the source indicates it's just not working like it used to. The idea of a single global ruler, perceived as having cracked in the collective mind. And the source really underlined this point. The elite's access to power structures, governments, etc., it was useless during the blackout if they couldn't generate their own internal energy. A sharp contrast, the source pointed out, to autonomous beings who, they perceived, found solutions and self-regulated during the chaos.
Were there other sectors besides the military that the source saw as being stuck during the event?
Yeah, the source specifically mentioned people in government positions, or really anyone heavily dependent on receiving orders, operating within very strict hierarchical structures. They were perceived as struggling because, well, they aren't normalized at taking action or generating solutions without explicit instructions coming down from above.
Okay, so looking at the present state, as perceived by the source around, say, May 1st, 2025, what's happening now?
The primary perception is one of just massive energetic reorganization, a huge shift.
Yeah.
There's a strong push, according to the source, towards autonomy and interdependence, but importantly, interdependence without hierarchy. However, the source also notes there's still significant global chaos, energetic chaos, physical, geopolitical, even involving intraterrestrial and extraterrestrial factors they mentioned. It's described as just a colossal restructuring process underway.
What about the possibility of more blackouts? Did this source touch on that for the future?
The source perceives more energetic fluctuations are likely, rather than, total widespread blackouts like that one. And any future attempts will be perceived, in their view, as failed attempts, at least on a large scale. If things do happen, they might be more localized, trying to create unease, perhaps, or scarcity in specific areas, rather than going for that mass fear generation or trying to claim energy has simply vanished altogether. The source actually found it, perceived it as ridiculous that advanced scientific beings would claim energy just ran out, like the sun suddenly turned off,
Right. And how does the source perceive this whole shift impacting people on an individual level?
The source sees people becoming more and more aware of their own autonomy, questioning the old systems, whether that's traditional prayer structures, various sects, governments, you name it. There's a growing recognition, perceived by the source, of local energy generation possibilities. Things like wind, heat, water vapor, which the source described as generating energy even faster, potentially, than the Industrial Revolution did. And this is tied, in the source's view, to an ongoing cognitive explosion perceived in people, a massive expansion of awareness.
And what about that information gap, the lack of a clear story about where the energy went during the blackout?
The source calls that lack of clear information an iceberg that they believe will inevitably lead to the fall of these old hierarchical structures. They expect fights over economic resources, maybe even violent attempts, will continue. But their actual impact, the source suggests, fundamentally depends on
how much collective energy gets fed into them by people.
IA, artificial intelligence, you mentioned it briefly. It came up again in the source material regarding this restructuring.
Yes, the source perceives IA as being involved somehow, involved in attempts to restructure territory, giving what the source termed energetic bites to the system, whatever that means precisely.
The source also drew a comparison between the Iberian Blackout and others, like in Venezuela, Ecuador, Cuba, Argentina.
Right. Those other events. They were perceived by the source as smaller scale. Experimental tests, really. Often linked, the source noted, to sacrifices and rituals, used to sort of refine the methods for a much bigger, macro-scale global attempt. The Iberian event, they suggested, was planned as one of these larger tests, but it seems it escalated. Went to a larger scale than intended, affecting the surrounding countries too. Portugal's impact was seen as lessened, described as a coletazo, like a whiplash effect, perceived as being absorbed by the water somehow, linked in the source's perception to it being a sound wave. Interesting detail.
In that initial story that went around, the cyber attack narrative, what did the source perceive was really behind putting that explanation out there?
The source viewed it mainly as a government security and defense protocol. They call it a lock. Basically, a way to justify activating defense and attack protocols if needed, and also perceived as a potential cover story, especially if there was external infiltration like extraterrestrial involvement as part of what happened. It allowed the authorities to frame it as we are defending ourselves, but the actual energetic, the esoteric information perceived by the source during the event, they stressed it was very, very different from that official narrative.
And the source's view on the president figure, you mentioned described as a puppet.
Yes, the source perceived this figure as a marionette, specifically using the word bouffon, which means like a jester, a fool, seen as lacking essence, lacking a core substance, and perceived as being programmed or even possessed by certain entities. The source specifically mentioned draconians and archons in this context.
Are these different control factions, these energetic congregations, still actively fighting amongst themselves according to the source?
The source perceives there are about 5 main factions right now, currently struggling for power or control, but significantly, without unified leadership. Examples given in the source included reptilians linked maybe to the UK and the VTK, draconians perhaps linked to France. The source also noted there are many hybridations, mixed groups involved. And the source indicates these groups are perceived as being weaker now. Why? Because they haven't had that constant supply of energy feeding them via the old methods, like mass sacrifices. And that VTK connection, it resurfaced again in the source material, specifically tied to attempts to block information about recent events there, things like conclaves, rituals. The source perceived it all as deeply intertwined, that hiding events at places like the VTK is directly linked to trying to hide the energy diversion attempt itself. The source was actually quite adamant that information about, say, intraterrestrial subsidies or the feeding of certain bases from real physical energy sources, that this will come out, maybe even within 3 months from when the source was recorded. Why? Because in their view, that fissure, that energetic leak or fissure, it simply cannot be sealed.
Okay, let's talk about that fissure again, that leak. How is energy flowing now based on the source's perception? Is it still leaking?
According to the source, yes, and it's not flowing correctly. Not to the surface, not to the intraterreno, that perceived inner earth or subsurface layer in the way it should or the way it was intended. The source described the current situation almost like a triangle, with a fissure at one corner, linking the intraterreno, our actual timeline that we're experiencing, and a past timeline. And energy is leaking through this fissure, primarily, according to the source's perception, towards the intraterreno and towards that past timeline.
But wait, the initial plan, according to the source, was to actually separate that past timeline, right? To cut it off.
Exactly. That was the goal. But the source states very clearly they failed in that attempt. So now the source perceives all 3 lines, the intraterrestrial, the actual present, and the past. They're all visible, perceived as connected. And a really significant consequence of this, according to the source, is that our actual timeline is being strengthened by this connection. Strengthened by seeing or accessing that past line, accessing a kind of memory of being autonomous, of being nourished differently than we are now. And the energy that is reaching the intraterreno through this fissure, it's now perceived by the source as being contaminated. Maybe interdependent is a better word, not controlled in the way the control groups wanted. The source suggests this leak energy is actually creating light and causing, doubt or chaos in those places that were previously ruled strictly by top-down orders. The source even used this analogy like it was an explosive that burned them, meaning it actually harmed those trying to control the energy flow.
So just to be clear, according to the source, they aren't getting the pure controlled energy they wanted from this whole diversion attempt.
Correct. That's the perception. And the source perceives they can no longer easily hide the fact that they are feeding these intracranial structures, or that they even tried to divert energy into some kind of past loop for their own gain. That's becoming visible now. So what's happening now, as the source perceives it, is that we, the beings who inherently generate this life energy, we are now in a position to consciously decide what we choose to feed. The source perceived that intraterrenal beings, and even those beings potentially in that past loop, they can generate their own energy too. All are interconnected in the source's view, but autonomy, true autonomy, within each line is possible. And simply seeing the connections between these lines helps that process unfold. The source mentioned this massive activation happening. They perceived something like 800 million essences were involved in releasing this information, this energy, describing it almost like a giant tangled knot finally coming untied.
Wow. And what did the source perceive as the consequences of this massive knot untying?
Communication, freedom, information. That's the core of it. The source perceived that crucial information is becoming freely available now for everyone, accessible for individual understanding and integration. And this, in their view, is leading naturally to deeper introspection, maybe increased empathy, and definitely more conscious choice about what individuals choose to nourish or support with their own energy. That initial attempt, to nourish a past timeline to create some kind of chaos loop, that failed, according to the source. Now, only information remains accessible across these connected lines, not separate functional control lines like they wanted.
And what about those beings the source mentioned earlier, the ones perceived as maybe being stuck with old sacrifice contracts or agreements?
Yeah, the source perceived that after that event, the one involving the 800 million SS release, those beings are no longer seen as being stuck in quite the same way. Information, the perception that they too can create their own energy, was perceived as being actively sent to them.
The source did emphasize, though, the impact all these fluctuations across these now visible lines had on sensitive beings, right? Feeling a kind of high voltage.
Yes, definitely. A sense of intensity. And that discernment, between what's physical reality and what's energetic reality is becoming maybe increasingly challenging for some, which the source highlighted really underscores the need for self-regulation, for grounding, for managing one's own energy field. And finally, the source highlighted the profound significance of the collective asking this question: what do they want to nourish? Referring to the collective consciousness, or what the source sometimes called volunteers. And the answer, as perceived by the source, was almost unanimous. Free information. Choice must be free, they stressed, not conditioned by any external forces. And here's the powerful perception from the source. If you consciously choose not to feed the intraterrenal bases or these old control structures with your energy, they cease to exist, energetically speaking. They lose their power source.
So wrapping this up, what does this all really mean, this deep dive, based entirely on these unique source materials we've explored? It paints a picture of that April 28th power outage event, not as some simple technical failure, not at all, but as this incredibly complex interplay of energetic flows, timeline mechanics, hidden structures, things that are perhaps far more interconnected and maybe more vulnerable than we've ever been led to believe.
It really suggests that, according to this source, perceived attempts by various forces seen and unseen to control energy, manipulate consciousness, hoard resources. Well, these attempts are meeting significant resistance, not just from other external forces fighting amongst themselves, but powerfully, maybe most powerfully, from the very essence of beings themselves. The source's perception of the failure, the complete backfiring of the April 28th event's intended chaotic outcome. Maybe that could be viewed as a kind of pivotal moment, a forced revelation almost.
Yeah, the idea that these old systems are genuinely cracking, that fundamental information about energetic reality is becoming more accessible, and that our own innate energy, our conscious choice are actually incredibly powerful forces in all this.
Well, that's a lot to take in, isn't it? It really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? From maybe feeling powerless in the face of these huge global events to recognizing, based on this source material at least, a profound potential for individual and collective autonomy.
And this raises, I think, an important question, perhaps the central question emerging from these particular sources. If our energy is indeed the primary resource fueling so many different systems, seen and unseen, just as these transcripts suggest, then what fundamentally happens when you, individually and collectively, consciously decide what you will, or perhaps more importantly, what you will not, feed with that energy?
Definitely something to mull over after this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.